My name is Nikki, and in the year 2011 I was diagnosed with having cancer in the lower part of my mouth after several years of inflamed ulcers, and yes, it was probably the biggest shock of my life. Looking back, my first symptoms were just a really nasty ulcer at the back of my throat, and I noticed it when I ate pineapple and other citrus fruits that I was going youch every time. But it's one of those things, I just carried on living with it. And also people around me noticed that I had a fairly permanent dry cough, again, which I think is one of the symptoms, but obviously I didn't know at that point. Well, I think it was my dentist that actually sent me off to see a mouth specialist, not actually Professor McGurk at this stage. And the jury was out, they took biopsies and they said that my cells were dysplastic, i.e. sort of cells that were changing shape a little bit, but it would be a wait and see. And we went round and round in circles. Some people said it was lichen planus, some people said it was an allergy, and it was only eventually when I was referred to the team at Guy's Hospital under Professor McGurk, Pepe Sherlaw and Michael Escudier that the real work began, and that's really how I came to be under the care of Professor McGurk. So really 4, 5, 6 years I can't remember past, and then on a holiday in Greece back in 2011 I just knew that something wasn't right. We were having a great time, but I was feeling very uncomfortable in my mouth. So I came back looking disgracefully healthy with a lovely suntan, went to see Professor McGurk, thinking he would say, oh, not to worry, but I could see his face change very quickly, and it was a Thursday, and he said, what are you doing on Saturday, because I want to take you in for a biopsy. And it was only at that point that the word cancer really even entered my consciousness. The impact was, I think there was something inside me that knew there was something wrong. It was very scary. My husband was out of the country, and so I rocked up on the Saturday morning, and the biopsy itself was pretty unpleasant, and I had to spend a night in hospital. And then, of course, the long wait happens after that to see what the results are. So really very uncomfortable, frightened. Didn't want to tell anyone at that point until I knew what was going on. And a few days later I went back to see Professor McGurk, and there was very little doubt that it was not only cancerous, but I was going to be operated on in about 10 days' time. And I think I actually fainted. I know that certainly I remember sort of coming around with glasses of water, and Professor McGurk putting his arm around me and just saying he would take great care of me. What happens after this is you almost go into a sort of numbness. It's a process. You know you have the date of your surgery, and you just have to jump through so many hoops, so many tests, so many x-rays, scans. Every single day for those following 10 days I was doing something linked in with the surgery. And then when the day came, I was lucky enough to be treated at the London Bridge Hospital, because it was a multidisciplinary case. And yes, it was a Saturday, and when I left home I tried to almost run away. I just did not want to get in that car, because all so unknown, the fear, but also I guess the relief that something was being done about it. Complex emotions, very complex, and trying to keep strong really for all those around me, particularly my elderly mother. The impact it had on my family was inevitably one of shock. Even though we'd known for many years that I had a problem there, it's like one of these things, however much you prepare for it, it's still a heck of a shock. And I think my role in it was to try and keep as calm as I could so that they won't worry too much, because at the end of the day you go under anaesthetic and I'm the one that least knows anything about it. So yes, it was trying to keep as upbeat as I could, have a good sense of humour, and just pray that I'd come out the other side relatively intact. It was removal of a piece of my arm that I can actually show you here. They took part of my arm tissue, which goes up there with the vein, and that was taken out and transplanted into the lower part of my mouth. It was like recarpeting my mouth. And then they took a piece of muscle from my tummy, and my tummy then filled in the gap from where the arm graft was. So all really rather complicated. And I came out obviously with an arm stapled with this graft, and a side effect that I hadn't been aware of in that an accessory nerve had been damaged. So I had all the symptoms of a frozen shoulder and couldn't really move my shoulder, so that was not something I had anticipated. So after I had my surgery, I was in the hospital for about 10 days, and I came out, and of course the mouth end is so swollen. So the big issues for me were eating, because when you have this surgery you're fed through the nose for the first 2 or 3 weeks, and that was a pretty horrible experience. I felt like I was eating horse food, and it would just go plop into my tummy, and I really found that unpleasant. And also drinking fluids. They have to make sure that you can swallow a glass of water before you're allowed to actually eat. So that took a good few weeks to get used to. And then of course the whole diet was pureed this, pureed that. And you're having to reinvent everything because your tongue is in a completely different position. Everything is swollen. You can't swallow properly. But somehow you have to just find ways of doing it. And at that point my speech was unintelligible. It was the whole time. And so I had to embark on some very serious speech therapy, which took a good 6 to 12 months, just practicing certain sounds and breathing techniques in order to be able to function again. My face was very lopsided. People thought I'd had a stroke, which I must say I found very, very upsetting, having had 3 strokes in my family in recent years. People would come up to me and be very assumptive and say, "Oh, when did you have that stroke?" And the trouble is, it's part of the body you can't hide. If people have another part of their body with cancer, you probably wouldn't necessarily know on first meeting. But with a face that's completely dropped on one side, speech which is difficult, and food and water spewing out of your mouth, it's pretty horrific, and it doesn't do your self-confidence any good. So I think that was probably one of the worst effects that I had. And you just have to hold your head up high and try your hardest, but people stare at you. You just don't want to go out in public, because even a cup of coffee, you'd try and drink it and it would come spurting out the other side. So the symptoms weren't particularly pleasant. So my surgery was back in, as I say, September the 4th, 2011, and within 6 months I was back at work. I had a very exciting job. I wanted to get back, and I was very determined. And Professor McGurk had said, yes, if you aim for that, I'm sure we can do it. So it was just at the point when I had to go through all these different treatments and the frozen shoulder, etc. So I went back, and little by little things got better and better. And it got to the point when you really couldn't see very much. I mean, I had the scar across my neck from the dissection from here to here, which of course at first looked like I'd always had my head chopped off. And it began to recede very quickly, and all in all, within a year, life was as good as it could be. I had the speech impairment and thought, well, that's great. So life got back to some relative sense of normality until the year of 2014. And would you believe it, I was on another holiday in Greece, knowing that something was a bit strange. What appeared to be a wisdom tooth was coming through the back of my jaw, And Professor McGurk at first said, "Don't worry, it's just a wisdom tooth coming through." Now I know jolly well that all my wisdom teeth came through and were taken out. So I thought, unless I am a slightly unnatural part of the species, this isn't a wisdom tooth. And cutting to the chase, sure enough, it was another cancerous growth at the back of the jaw. Now it looked like the sort of tip of an iceberg, and everyone was quite scared in terms of how far it had penetrated. So having tried antibiotics, etc., etc., it was then time again for another biopsy. And it was quite a long wait for the results this time. And I got the phone call a day or so later after I was expecting it, to be told the news that yes, it was cancerous, but I didn't know the full extent of it. So that really was one heck of a shock, because I was told if I could get past 3 years, I would be okay. But whether there was a tiny seed left, we just don't know. So again, it had all been planned for me before I got the result, what was going to happen. And this time, the shock of what was proposed was really quite incredible. For what appeared to be a centimetre, I guess, I don't know, of cancer at the back of my jaw, they then proposed taking out the whole of my fibula, which is the weaker of the two leg bones on my left leg, to take that out and to remove half of my jaw from here to here and replace it with my leg bone and some titanium. So that was really, again, it was another massive shock. Having to phone my mother, who was overseas at that point, and tell her again. She couldn't even speak, and thank goodness I had friends with her. She just couldn't believe it, because I've never smoked a cigarette in my life. Yes, I like my glasses of wine, but not I'm not a spirits drinker. And the question was, why me? Why me again? It just doesn't make sense. I think even Professor McGurk was really puzzled by it. So on Halloween of all days, I was admitted again. Had my last final supper because I wouldn't be able to eat for a while. And the surgery the next day was apparently very, very long, very complicated, because I guess all the internal capillaries and vessels and nodes were all in a different place. I was injected, I didn't undergo sentinel node biopsy, but something similar to it, where they injected nuclear dye around the tumour. And that was quite scary, because they say, whatever happens, do not swallow. Now you're flat on your back for several hours whilst this takes place, and being told not to swallow is quite hard. But I guess it was just to really reference where the tumour was, so that when they went into surgery they could do all sorts of things. I think they made a replica of my head. I wish I'd been able to keep it, that would have been fun, wouldn't it? But no, this was a real marathon of an operation. You can imagine there was somebody opening up my leg, taking the bone out, tying bits off, I guess, and then bits of here, there, everywhere. I don't know how many pieces they took, but it was quite complex. I think the surgery was about 15 hours, and obviously my family had a very long wait for that. Morphine messes with your head. It was hideous afterwards. And for the first 4 or 5 days after recovery, no one would let me have a mirror because I looked like Frankenstein. Not a pretty sight. So here we go again, with different complications, learning to walk again, trying to cope with this whole new structure in my head, and yeah, I guess Groundhog Day all over again. Well, again, it was another 6 months, and I was able to go back to work part-time. I worked for the NHS, which is obviously quite an advantage, because if I was ever in any trouble, they would put me on the drip and various things. So, yeah, I got going again after six months. The leg itch situation was horrible. I kept falling over and bashing myself, and people would then again think I'd had a stroke because my speech was slurred. Eating was very complicated, and there was a massive great crater in the side of my face, and again the palsy, and it was Yeah, it was just really ghastly being out in public. And I had some plastic surgery done where, can you believe it, they found some fat behind my knees. I thought, no, surely not. And they took fat out from behind my knees and put me under again and centrifuged it and pumped it back in. So it's amazing what they can do. And what with that and various injections that I have now, my face is now more or less symmetrical, apart from I get tired. And my speech, yes, I'm always going to have this lisp, but as long as I'm intelligible, I'm alive, and I'm just so grateful to be alive.